In the deep sea, life is slow, dark, and generally squidgy. If you're one of those creatures that depends on a hard surface to attach to, and actually you look like you might be, then sponges are an absolute lifeline. Because there are many things, many organisms that just couldn't survive without something like them to grow on top of. And as a result, you end up with entire ecosystems developing on something like this. Before we get started, I'd just like to welcome all the new people that have found the channel in recent weeks, or even possibly just now. So whether you're an academic or complete beginner, you are very, very welcome, and it's lovely to have you here. What I'm trying to do with this channel is make the more interesting bits of the fossil record, the history of life in general, i.e. not dinosaurs, as accessible as I can, just for the sheer fascination of it. I'm an active paleontological researcher, although mostly independent, so I do this as a hobby, but I have nearly 100 papers so far, and I'm also a general naturalist, so I really enjoy tying in the modern world to the fossil record and vice versa, which is something I'll be doing today, in fact. So, my wife and collaborator Lucy Muir often pops up in these videos as well. She's also a paleontologist, and we generally publish together. I'm actually trying to make this my day job, so I'm really grateful to all those people who come along and watch the videos, and especially subscribe, join the comments, stick around, and just make this channel part of a lovely little community, which it's really developing into. If you would like to support our work more directly, then there is also a little join button in which there is a membership option, which for a few pounds a month you get access to extra videos which are tied more directly to unpublished work and papers that we are currently working towards. So exciting bits of paleontology which we can't put into the public domain yet in case it sort of scuppers publication. So if you'd like to join up with that, you'll get probably a couple of extra videos a month on things that you won't see any other way. Most of those are related to the Castle Bank biota, which we discovered a few years ago near our home in Mid Wales, and we're working on steadily. Okay, on to the star of the show for today. This incredible thing here is a glass sponge, a Hexactinellid called Pheronema. The species, well, the common one is Carpenteri, but that shouldn't have spines as long as this one. So I've actually drawn a blank so far with working out which species this is, and it's just possible that this is something undescribed. It's a specimen that I actually bought. I can't go and collect things like this because they live in the deep sea, and it's not something that I actually agree with doing. I have a very small collection of teaching and research specimens which are of active and direct use to interpretation of fossils. I do not support the large-scale collection of these things at all, and if I had easier access to museum specimens, then I would be using them instead. But having acquired just a couple of them, I think this is well, repaid itself many times over, and being able to share what we can learn from it with the rest of you, so you don't all need to go and buy one yourself, because it's quite a destructive process actually fishing with these things with tangle nets. That's got to be a good thing. There are grey areas related to whether it's a good idea to actually have one of these ourselves, but because I can do so much with it in showing you all sorts of things, I think, on balance, it's worth it. So, what we have here is a glass sponge that lived in the deep ocean, probably a kilometre or more down in most cases, and they live on soft substrates where you have this tangle of spicules, and these little hairy bits at the base, which are embedded in the seafloor. Like all glass sponges, this skeleton of spines is made of opal, hydrated silicon dioxide, not quite crystalline but sort of pseudo-crystalline, and the soft tissues are extremely thin, delicate, diaphanous things. So this is very light, it's almost entirely hollow. The soft tissues are just membranous, layers enclosing cavities and chambers inside where it sucks water through the sides and pumps it out through the top and filters out any yummy goodness that's microscopic enough for it to actually eat. So that's an interesting thing in itself. I mean, I have gone on about glass sponges quite a bit anyway, but today what I want to look at is all the stuff stuck to it. These spines sticking out the side are actually dead material. They are not soft tissue. They're extruded by the soft tissue, pushed out and grown as these clumps of spicules. And those spicules are then just dead material. They are bits of skeleton sticking out into the water, where there is no reaction of the sponge to anything that lands on it. They're just there as a potential substrate. And you can see that there are actually lots and lots of tangly bits wrapped around all these spicules. So what we're going to do today is look at some of this stuff in the microscope and see how much diversity there is living on these sponges that would probably find no other substrate in the deep sea. For those interested, this is the microscope I'm using. It's a Leica S8 APO, which is a really lovely, quite new machine, and with an extremely nice camera on the top, and then a cross-polarizing ring light at the base here, which you can turn this dial to cross a polarizer which cuts out all sorts of reflections and has many, many uses. I'm actually about the maximum working distance here in order to focus this up in order to get this thing underneath it. So it's not the easiest thing to focus on, but I can get really nice images of what is under here. So let's have a look. So this is the base of one of these clusters of spines sticking out the side and a bit of the surface of the sponge. So you can see this very fine sort of lacework of the dermal layer, the skin surface of the sponge itself, and then this cluster of really coarse spines sticking out from the side. But if we focus down onto the next set of spines down here, you can start to see we've got some of this tangly stuff growing all over it. And this tangly stuff is really rather intriguing. So you zoom into here and you can see it's a series of little cups coming off a stalk. Those little stalks are attached to things on the surface that are growing over the spines, and then they're growing out into this little tangle of little cups of, where things were living. So this is a colony of, in this case, hydrozoans. So related to corals and jellyfish, they're cnidarians, and they produce this organic skeleton with lots of little individuals joined together into a colony. And it's rather extensive. So you can see there's actually quite a lot of things living in this little area. So hydrozoans are, as I say, cnidarians. They are predators, microcarnivores in this case, and the individual animals would have little tentacles with stinging cells on and would fire and anything brushes past them and poison and then devour these little tiny creatures. So you'd be looking at really minute animals. So these individual cups are pretty tiny. Let me just work that out. I think they're about 1 millimetre long, that stalk. Just need to put a scale bar on, which you won't be able to see. Yeah, that little side branch there with the 2 cups on it is about 1 millimetre long. So that area is actually quite extensive. This is a big fluffy patch about 1 centimetre or 2 across, which is really visible with the naked eye. It's just you can't quite make out the detail. But, of course, there's probably a lot more to it as well. So if we zoom in on some of these areas, when there's something else looking a bit odd there, what's that? That appears to be a calcite tube. It's a white crystalline material. It's got some debris on the surface, but that's basically a smooth tube of calcium carbonate of something that cemented itself to one of these spicules. That's interesting, isn't it? What would do something like that? There are actually several options for something like this, and I'm not totally sure which it is. These could be very small annelid worms, although what I don't like is the way it gets wider to the closed end. That's unusual. Normally worm tubes get wider towards the opening because they're growing that way and building it up as they go along. So I think more likely is this is some sort of protist, an amoeba-like organism, single-celled, which is secreting this sort of calcite test, a bit like a foraminifera, for those who know those things, and then growing it, making it longer as they grow, but it has a narrow opening that its little pseudopods would come out and catch anything edible that's floating past it. So that would be my guess. Probably an amoeba of some sort for that one. Okay. Let's have a wander around, because there's so much on here, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to find for you. Lots more of the tangly hydroids. And more and more. Okay, not a huge amount different there, at least at this scale. If we zoom in even more, we're probably going to find other things too. You can spend hours and hours just poring over whatever you can see down this microscope. And quite often not getting very far. Okay, let's have a look at the other side, I think. Right, so here there is an area where there are lots of other tangles that look, at first glance, to the naked eye, very similar to what we were looking at the other side. But actually they are entirely different. This is kind of suspended, almost dangling like a little Christmas bauble off one of the spines. And you can see it's much more of a poorly defined network. If we zoom into these areas, there are bits of spicules tangled up in there as well, but mostly this is very odd, lumpy texture of lots of bits stuck together. It's not a nice smooth skeleton, doesn't have a clearly defined shape. It's just a tangle of, well, a bunch of fibres forming a network, and those fibres seem to be composed mainly of other things stuck together. These agglutinated structures are actually quite common. There are quite a few things that stick sand grains together to form a tube. Think caddisfly larvae, for example, in your days of pond dipping at school, or hopefully still today if you've got any sense. But these are a little different. I'm fairly certain, although we can't see the soft body of the animal or organism, but based on the shape of it, I'm fairly certain this is a thing called a Xenophyophore. So I'm not totally sure that this is a Xenophyophore. It may be something else that's related to it, some other sort of protist that forms a reticulate structure, but that's the best guess I've got at the moment. What is a Xenophyophore? Some of you may be asking yourselves. And understandably so, because most people have no idea. But they are one of the most interesting and mysterious creatures of the deep sea. They're actually quite abundant large organisms on the abyssal plain, and they turn up regularly in remote submersible explorations and so on. But we still don't know an awful lot about them. We do know now that they are foraminiferans. These things, which can get up to, I've heard up to a metre, but certainly 20-30 centimetres across, forming these weird sort of colony structures. Well, they're not colonies. In fact, they're not even multicellular. These are the largest single-celled organisms in the world that we know of. And they do cheat a little bit, because they actually have lots and lots of nuclei. They're what we call syncytial. So it is a single cell with loads of nuclei. Normally one cell has one nucleus. So this is kind of cheating, and we're not totally sure how this developed. We also don't know exactly how they eat or what they eat, but they form this structure made of agglutinated sand grains and other things that they stick together to form a network of tubes with the soft tissue of this protist living inside them and spreading out and picking up material from the sea floor, we think. Some of them apparently even farm bacteria, so it is said, and they've been suggested that this is possibly the maker of a long-standing, very mysterious trace fossil, which still lives today. We find them in the deep sea, but we don't know what makes them. Going back to the Cambrian, called Paleodictyon, which is a very regular hexagonal network below the surface of the sea floor, with a series of little pipes coming up to the surface. I'll probably do a video just on that at some point. But those have been suggested to be farming traces, and it's possible that they are actually made by Xenophyophores. We know surprisingly little about them because they're incredibly delicate. Apparently you try to pick them up from the deep sea and they normally disintegrate. So it's difficult to get much useful information out of them. But they sometimes do attach to sponges. In fact, some of them agglutinate only the spicules of Hexactinellids, which has led to a lot of confusion, and Xenophyophores were once thought to be sponges. Possibly partly for that reason. I'd have to go into the history to work out exactly why. But they've been put into various groups, and certainly there is potential for confusion as fossils with hexactinellid sponges if you have this agglutinating network structure made purely of spicules. Life is really just out to confuse us sometimes, and yeah. Oh well, let's see what else there is. So, tangled up with this Xenophyophore, of course, we're getting fragments of all sorts of other things, but there's more than fragments, because we go over to this part. That is something else that is using this presumably Xenophyophore structure as a substrate to grow on itself. So this, you can see, is made of a mass of tiny little spicules, and this is also a sponge. Pretty certain this is a demosponge. Haven't tested the composition of the spicules, but they look like they're silica rather than calcite, and that is a very small one, but it's some sort of demosponge which is normally adapted to extremely shallow water conditions, most of them, but they do also live in the deep seas, and this is clearly one of those things that lives in the deep sea. It's rather lovely, really, with this sort of mass of tiny little delicate needles. These needles are one of the reasons why you don't want to go putting your hands through deep sea sediment and without very strong gloves on. And actually, on a slightly more serious note, why there is blindness quite common in tribes in South America where they use river water full of needles like this from freshwater sponges to wash their faces with. So they can be quite dangerous things. But there we go, that's a lovely little sponge which is attached to the Xenophyophore, or presumed Xenophyophore, which is itself attached to these large spines sticking out from the Pheronema. That's not bad, is it? A whole little community here, and apparently some of the larger Xenophyophores actually act as nurseries for juvenile fish, because they can just live inside the spaces and provides protection, shelter for them, and so on. Okay, there's another little mass of stuff on this one. Let's have a quick look in here. And that is a multi-chambered shell. I'm going to zoom in and put the brightness up a bit. Yeah, and that has got to be, I think, a Foraminifera. So this is one of the more standard little protists, amoeba, that make shells, in some cases, of multiple chambers, like we're seeing here. So that's quite nice. There's a whole community of little Foraminifera living here, some of them gigantic multinucleate Xenophyophore-like things, and others much more ordinary. Okay, here's another little bundle of spicules with some very fine spicules sort of wrapped around it. And you move along here and we see a couple of things, actually. Firstly, there is another tiny little agglutinated tube. Now, this might be part of the same sort of structure as before, a little Xenophyophore, Or it might be, again, a different type of foraminifera which has been sticking sand grains together to make a little tube to live inside. But again, it's probably a protist. I think it's too small really to be an annelid worm, and the shape isn't really right for one of those either. You'd expect that to be more cemented to the surface. But next to it is this lovely little thing. This is a tiny little bivalve mollusk. I believe it's a saddle oyster, probably in the genus Anomia or something like that. And you do get these washing up along beaches attached to the holdfasts of kelp and so on. But here it's a little bit different. It's, well, presumably a specialist in very deep sea habitats. Ah, that's rather a nice thing to find, and it's not the only one. There's another one attached just there. And you can see there's lots and lots of bits of gubbins, strange stuff stuck to the surfaces, which is probably mostly microbial colonies, things like that. So not even protists, but single-celled, probably prokaryotes, I'd guess. So there's a whole array of things living on just this one little spine. Here's something a little bit different. This again is tiny, just a couple of millimetres or so long, or a few millimetres anyway. And this we have a sort of chain of structures with spikes coming off. And I'll have to tell you what that is, because it's not really obvious from that one bit, but there are a few other fragments that I can sort of carefully manipulate under the microscope, but it's very difficult to show you the whole thing, just because of the angles. But these are the arms of brittle stars. These very delicate relatives of starfish that are mostly filter feeding, and they sort of climb up onto high surface vantage points in order to get a good sort of reach into the water, where they capture things with their arms and then pull them back to a little body in the middle. But these are another group of organisms that are using the sponges. And another little foraminifera. These are quite lovely things when you get them up close. Almost looks like a tiny ammonite, but isn't. Ooh, now this is a fun one. Going back to those xenophyophores, I mentioned there are some that use sponge spicules. They stick sponge spicules together to make their little network. And it looks to me as if this might be what we're seeing here. You can zoom in on this and you can see there's a large number of little spicules all bonded together, but in a very unsponge-like way. They've all sort of joined at particular little points. And these spicules do not all belong to one thing, because at the end there is a great big spicule here with 3 rays actually coming in at angles, so that's part of a 4-rayed spicule called a tetractin. So that belongs to a demosponge, but a very different demosponge to the other one that we saw. And this will have been picked up from the sediment and stuck together with all these other little, much simpler spicules to make this intriguing little network structure. And it's also incorporated tiny little calcitic tubes. I'm not even sure what that one would have belonged to, probably yet another type of foraminifera, I'd guess. But they're making the most of whatever's available, basically. This one seems to be a different hydrozoan to the one we looked at, another little hydroid. And these are much shorter, sort of stubbier cups coming off a network that's actually encrusting over the spicules. But it does seem to be a hydrozoan. So that again is a different species living on the same habitat. Here's a good one. I've been waiting for one of these. This is something that you get growing on seaweeds around coastlines very, very commonly. It's a bryozoan, a moss animal, a little colony with each of those holes being the entrance to a small cell in which there was a little animal. And it would stick its little filter-feeding tentacles out and capture anything yummy out of the water. So they're very tiny animals, a very diverse group, and they have a long fossil record as well, at least the ones that make a calcite skeleton. So I have no idea which species this is. It certainly isn't a familiar one from the coastline, as you would expect, but this is probably a deep sea specialist that lives on hard surfaces, and the only thing it can get around here, it looks like, is a sponge spiculum. There is actually more. There are more different foraminifers, probably another, I don't know, 5 or 6 that I've seen at least. It's probably quite a bit more when you start looking closely. There are more little tiny tubes, agglutinated and calcareous, maybe the same things, maybe a bit different. There was also, at least at one point, a barnacle, but I can't find it, so I fear that it's fallen off. It was a tiny little relative of goose barnacles, just a couple of millimetres long. But I've had this quite a few years now, and sadly it may have dropped off into the, well, it may be in the bottom of the pot. Anyway, it's a really interesting thing to look at because there's an entire ecosystem of mostly very small organisms that have made their home on this sponge. And in many cases, they're not animals. Most of what we're looking at there is forams, foraminifers, protists, xenophyophores, which are probably another group of forams, various other amoebae, which are probably also technically a group of forams, or the other way around. And most of what we're finding is quite large, single-celled organisms. There are animals. There are the little brittle stars which are clambering their way over the spines and reaching up into the water. There are the hydroids and the bryozoans, which are both little tentacled filter-feeding things which also are using the sponge to get up above the seafloor to areas where the water is actually moving. So right at the seafloor itself, the water barely moves. Once you get up into the water column a little bit, there's more of a current, very, very slow, but enough to bring food to at least very small animals. So most of these things have very low metabolic rates. They don't need a huge amount of energy. They probably live quite slowly. Most of the deep sea animals do. It's like the sponge itself may have lived for centuries. It's an interesting insight into how life has adapted to these deep ocean habitats, which are quite challenging in many ways. But how far back in the fossil record does this type of ecology go? When we have all this diversity of things forming quite a wide range of structures, quite obviously visible all over these spines, we should be able to see bits of that in the fossil record. But in general we don't. When you go back to the Mesozoic in the Cretaceous, for example, there are quite a few massive sponges there, things which have a hard skeleton that hangs around for a long time after the sponge has died. Those you can get encrusting worm tubes on. In reef environments, going back quite a lot further, the same thing happens. You have a massive skeleton of a sponge which is there long after the sponge is dead. And then you can have things like bryozoans and even echinoderms, things like crinoids, can encrust the surfaces. This has been shown back to the Ordovician. So certainly when you have the exoskeleton of a sponge which then basically acts as a rock, that gets encrusted. But it's a little different to what we're seeing here when they're using the live sponge, or the spine sticking out of the live sponge, as a habitat in life. Because after these die, they do disintegrate, they'll fall apart, and the habitat will no longer be there. And again, it's in reef habitats where everything is growing on top of each other as fast as it can to avoid being swamped by something else. If you go back to the Cambrian, the Burgess Shale type faunas, where everything soft-bodied has been fossilised, you might expect there to get traces of the same sort of things. But we don't. At least nothing except a few specialist brachiopods that seem to be particularly keen to live on the spines of a few types of sponges. Pheronema and chancelloriids, which I include as sponges, other people don't. Your mileage may vary. But they are also sponge-like animals rooted into the seafloor with these long spines sticking out, and there are brachiopods that attach to those as well. So there is a certain amount of diversity of things attaching to those sponges in the Cambrian, but it's only, as far as I'm aware, brachiopods. Of course, there are limitations. Bryozoans didn't appear until the Ordovician. Xenophyophores we don't honestly know how far back they go because it's so difficult recognising them. There's suggestions, I think, even of Precambrian ones, but it's just very difficult to tell. Then there are the hydroids, and colonial hydroids of the type that are familiar today also don't really have much of a fossil record, and I think it goes back to the Ordovician. Just checked, and it actually makes it into the late Cambrian with a thing called Paleodiphasia from China. Rather nice, definitely a hydroid, but virtually all of them are Ordovician and late. So again, you wouldn't get those in the Cambrian Burgess Shale type faunas because apparently they weren't there. Barnacles, also Ordovician. So we've got a lot of groups that are living on this sponge which didn't appear until the Ordovician, which is unusual. Most groups of animals were there in the Cambrian. And in fact, many foraminiferans are also slightly later in the fossil record. There are agglutinating forams in the Ordovician, and these are also not common until later in the Paleozoic. So it looks as though the types of organisms that we find encrusting these sponges were a relatively late stage of animal evolution compared with the origin of the phyla that we see in the Cambrian. So of course there are some encrusting things in the Cambrian, but most of the diversification of the modern groups seems to have happened a little bit later. But how much later? Because we have the Angibiota, which has spectacular preservation of soft-bodied fossils going back to the latest Ordovician and representing a deep-sea community of many things that kind of look like this. There are many species with spines sticking out into the sediment. And yet, we don't see anything encrusting those at all. No brachiopods, no xenophyophores, no hydroids, no bryozoans. There is nothing on them, as far as we can see. So what we may be seeing is a pattern here of diversification of these filter-feeding, suspension-feeding, sessile groups that are encrusting hard surfaces in the Ordovician, but in shallower water. And then gradually those adapted to deeper and deeper ecosystems until at some point they managed to colonize the only habitats available in the deep oceans, which would be these. Well, not quite the only one. There are things like nodules on the seafloor and so on. But one of the most widespread and available habitats for encrusters, which actually takes things up off the seafloor and into the water column, would be sponges. Without more information, there's not much further we can go at the moment with this story. It's limited. We don't have the fossils to tell us when exactly this happened. But it's a really interesting story, and it's just an aspect of modern ecology that we don't normally think about. In the fossil record, we don't normally think about the deep sea at all because we don't see it. But it's always worth discussing these things that we don't normally think about because it's another perspective, another angle on the history of life, which is all part of this wider evolving tapestry of life. Okay, that will probably do it for this one. Next one, well, we're planning on doing another one for the members-only group on one of the slightly spectacular Castlebank fossils that we're working on at the moment and writing up. And after that, I've got a few ideas. I'll let you know fairly soon. See you soon.